Okay, welcome everybody. We'll wait here just a couple minutes to let people enter the webinar. We'll be with you in just a moment. Okay, well, it's 10 o'clock here on the West Coast and 1 o'clock on the East Coast. So let's get started with this webinar, which is titled Untangling Rot, Efficient IG Solutions and Data Management with Gimmal and Kindato. A little overview of what we're going to go through today is a focus on modern information governance strategies. This session is designed to equip you with practical, hands-on knowledge to untangle and efficiently manage your data, regardless of where it resides. Our expert presenters from Gimmal and Kindato will walk you through real-world scenarios and case studies to illustrate how an effective IG strategy can significantly enhance the efficiency and compliance of your IG program. While Microsoft 365 or Purview offers a suite of powerful tools for data management, this masterclass will expand your view to encompass a broader range of solutions and strategies, highlighting how Gimmal's Discover solution for data identification and policy application technology complements extends the capabilities of M365, ensuring a comprehensive and effective approach to data management. I'm Robert Smallwood. I'm CEO of InfoGov World, and we are hosting our conference, our first physical one in person, October 2nd to 4th in San Diego. The pre-conference sessions are on the 2nd, which is Monday. The 3rd and 4th are the conference sessions, and we have over 50 outstanding expert speakers. And we also wanted to let you know that the following days, the 5th and 6th, are the IAPP Privacy, Security, and Risk Conference, which is, when you talk about privacy, security, and risk, that's basically information governance. That'll be in San Diego as well. So you can come to San Diego and perhaps hit both of those conferences at once. Our presenters today are Jeff Tuish from Gimmal, who's a sales engineer and solution architect. Jeff brings more than 4 decades of consulting and software solutions experience to help clients solve complex business problems that include rot analysis, sensitive data discovery, and retention enforcement on various data sources. Jeff specializes in information governance using Gimmal Discover and Gimmal Records and helps clients understand how to best leverage their desired technologies and use cases within the Gimmal suite of products. In 1998, he created a product named Mail Attender, which was the catalyst for the creation of Sherpa software in 2000. Which Gimmal acquired in 2021, is now known as Gimmal Discover. We also have Jason Velasco, who's the CEO of Kindato, which is a consulting and services firm in IG. Jason's a 20-year electronic discovery industry veteran, skilled in helping organizations tackle complex e-discovery, information governance, and data compliance challenges. As CEO of Kindato Corp and lead information governance e-discovery advisor, Jason offers invaluable guidance to clients. Welcome, Jeff and Jason.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we really appreciate the introduction. So looking forward to seeing you in October. That's going to be exciting, San Diego.
Yeah, it's going to be all things IG, all of the creme de la creme of the IG practitioners and IG consultants and software providers will be there, including Gimmal and Kindato. So welcome anyone to attend. And at the end of this webinar, we'll give you a discount code. And you can get a healthy discount if you'd like to attend that conference in San Diego.
And it's well worth it. I mean, I've seen the schedule, Robert, and I think you put together a really good batch of expertise and people, and then talk about hands-on experience, which is one of the things we'll talk about as part of this webinar. I mean, talk about people that have been in the trenches for the last 10 or 15 years. Pretty excited about it.
Yeah, Gimmal will be well represented. I won't be there personally, but Gimmal's going to have some experts there as well.
Yeah, we've got really some top people lined up from major law firms like DLA Piper, Dentons, and Baker & McKenzie, Baker Hostetler, and major companies like USAA, FedEx, Cisco, Wells Fargo. So you're going to have some really top experts in information governance with deep expertise in privacy, cybersecurity, e-discovery, data governance, and records management, which are the core facets of IG. So let's get started, guys. Let's learn about how we can get rid of the rot and we can add value or leverage value within these organizations.
Yeah, and thank you, Robert. I appreciate the introduction. And Jeff, really thank you for joining us. just a little background, as Robert mentioned, Kindato is really a boutique professional services and technology company, really helping people untangle this rot. We do a lot with legacy data. We do a lot of workflow automation with e-discovery, things along those lines. We started working with Gimmal over the last year because of their technology solution to help us with our own professional service. We worked with them to develop a migration as a service practice. We call it MAP, which really is actually migration plus IG. And it's all about how do you take this data that's cost risky, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a little bit as we go through the presentation, but how do you get value out of using information governance principles? And so right now we've been also working with Jeff, and I've been working closely with him in terms of how do we actually identify rocks with the Gimmal technology? How do we leverage it, and how do we build some real practice around that? So Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Gimmal technology, and then we'll talk about, some of these big issues out there.
Yeah, one of the things that Gimmal Discover can do is not only going after file shares, which typically is what most people are concerned about when you're talking about rot, but there's rot in other places as well. So Discover can go through and manage rot within, for instance, within the file shares. We can go out to the endpoints if you're concerned about laptops, desktops, having that kind of data as well. Also into the different 365 data sources such as OneDrive, SharePoint, and email. And email is something else I'll be talking about in a bit. So we can do all that as well as things outside of Microsoft. So if you happen to use Box, Dropbox is coming soon as one of our agents that we'll be connecting to, as well as the G Suite. So any of this type of data is going to have rot in it because, Jason, as we all know, we're all hoarders in one way or another. We keep data that we don't need, and we typically don't clean it up until either we're running out of space or some other issue pops up that makes us actually aware of what we have.
That's exactly right. And I think you hear one of the stats that I think we looked at is that, rot can consume 25 to 75% of your file share. And when we were talking a little bit about this, a couple of days as we were prepping for this, one of the questions that kind of popped up was, well, we've been talking about rot for a while now, right? I mean, this has been an issue, it's been a challenge. And I think one of the reasons why this has come up for me, because especially in light of moving to the cloud, especially with the opportunity of all the great technology that's in the Microsoft 365 stack, which is where we focus a lot of our time and effort on, this really becomes a really cool opportunity to not only handle your rot information, but how do you actually transition into knowledge, right? So, so Jeff, with your clients in Gimmal, because you guys do a lot of record work, you've done a ton of ID work on the technology side, what's the size and how has that really started to impact the organization you've been working with?
Yeah, it's funny, Jason, because you're absolutely right. Rot has been on the radar for a long time. Unfortunately, we're still seeing a lot of people that haven't done anything about it. And you'll see this chart that we have here displayed. The amount of growth in unstructured data is not getting any smaller. It's getting exponential. So people are just saving more and more data. And unfortunately, if you're not taking any steps to mitigate that or remediate it, then the problem's not going to get any better without you ignoring it. So you can't really put your head in the sand hoping that the problem's going to go away. It's not. Now, is it a daunting task? Absolutely. Is it a lot of undertaking to do? It is, but there's no better time than the present to start because the data is just going to keep growing. So once again, even though rot has been a discussion for years, we're seeing a lot of clients that are starting now to understand we need to do something about this and where it is.
Exactly. And one of the things that has always intrigued me about information governance that kind of drove me into that area comparatively to the e-discovery side, which is e-discovery is reactive and information governance is, they say, proactive. I'm seeing information governance is a lot more reactive these days because now we have to get a handle around the information.
Sure.
But the principles for identifying and using the same thing are really the same thing, right? It's the same tools, it's the same methodology as we'll talk about. So we're going to focus a lot on unstructured data files because there's mail and things along those lines. But some of the data sources that we're looking at are things like desktops and and laptops. It's one of the things that I know that the Discover tool really focuses on, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You've got your file shares, you've got your cloud stuff, you've got your SharePoint, you have your on-premise file servers, and of course you have your email. Now, coming from the regulated industry for a lot of the work that I've done, we have to deal with that. And there's some specific rules and some unique aspects to that. But for the folks that don't earn that space, it can be pretty daunting even on the email side.
Sure, it can.
Right.
And what's funny is that, you know, the product that I wrote, Mail Tender, my gosh, it's 25 years ago. I did that because of people wanting the ability to enforce retention policies on email, which in essence is rot. So to have that culture, and people are still doing that today. We're doing it with Discover of, for instance, anything older than 90 days in the inbox gets moved to a to be deleted folder, and a week later it gets deleted. People are setting up those policies and enforcing them. But to see that culture then change to actually going after files instead of email, even though files are in email, sometimes attachments, it's just not catching on. People aren't doing it as much. So what's interesting, I think, is getting all the appropriate groups together, which we'll be talking about later, and be able to actually have them all collaborate and agree on how they want to tackle this. It's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch.
Hey,
Yeah.
Jeff and Jason, what would you say the biggest problems that rot causes? What's the result? What's the impact of having all that rot swimming around? Some people say, well, we've got great search, I can find what I need.
Sure.
What happens if you have too much rot piling up?
I mean, these risks that we have here are valid, especially the data leakage, and not so much for intentional. I'm not talking about anybody doing anything draconian and going out and selling data. I'm talking about more of laptops, desktops, especially laptops, phones being stolen, being lost, and that data being exposed on them. I mean, hacks and ransomware. We've had a couple clients in the past year actually have been affected by ransomware, which is very sad to see, but that's not so much of this. But honestly, let's talk about e-discovery with this. So the more data you have, and if you don't know where it is and what's in it, searching that data is going to take longer. And let's be honest, a lot of legal times, the immediacy of those searches returning the result set as quickly as possible is a very good thing. To have somebody say, well, it's going to take me 3 months to look at all my data, judges aren't going to put up with that time. So getting that rot managed to be able to have your size of your data reduced is really a key when you talk about e-discovery.
Well, I mean, and let's even go back a second ago. And let's actually, I think we clearly identify what rot is. Let's define that. That stands for redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. And those are three distinct different categories, right? So trivial data, I mean, it can be defined as lots of different things. It can be ranged anywhere from like ESPN.com type emails or communication to, hey, let's meet for the birthday party, right? And it's going to depend on organization to organization. The redundant stuff, I find that super interesting. And that's where we're going to get into some of the technology pieces out there, right? And you have your clearly exact duplicates of stuff that gets copied over and over and over again. Like one of my first big projects was, like the Enron backup tape data, where we were looking at daily backup tapes. You have incremental changes of 0.05% on a day-to-day basis. That's a lot of redundant information. But redundant could also be near duplicate, things that may have slight modifications, right? Trying to identify that. Now, go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say what's interesting, Jason, is when I was talking about going back to email, one of the things we see a lot of times, so let's take this to file shares and try to draw some lines here, is that many companies will give the users a folder within their mailbox to store things that would be considered rot, but they want to consider a business record, or they want to protect it for some reason. Obviously, that has to be monitored and making sure it's not being misused. But the same thing could happen with file shares or with OneDrive. We're going to go through and we're going to go find everything. We're going to put it into another location or have you protect the things that you want to keep. But once again, having that culture and political accept that, it's just different. It's just not, all the dots aren't connecting yet.
Right. And going back to Robert's question specifically, and about folks, if you've got questions, go ahead and put them in there. Robert's going to be monitoring that, and we'll bring that up. And we'd love the engagement. My favorite part is the Q&A part. So if you want to bring more Q&A up front, we can do that.
Awesome.
But to go back to your particular question, the question in terms of those risks, I mean, e-discovery, as you mentioned, is one of those. Because I mean, you're either going to have your white knight documents or your emails. But there's also, in a lot of cases, because if there's so much information, sometimes that story gets mixed with all when you have redundant and a lot of that information. So the cost of storage is another one of those big risks because, I mean, people pay for that.
Right.
But I also think there's an organizational risk because if you have so much information and people can't identify it and they can't create value out of it from a knowledge perspective, it's costing your organization productivity time and the opportunity to actually get their work done. Tangentially, you know, when we see people implement knowledge management strategies coming out of a ROT workflow, their productivity goes up 30–40% once
Right.
they've actually put good tagging and labeling as they go through the process.
Yeah, it's like
I think you
like
really
having
hit
your
on it
junk
there,
drawer.
Jason.
I'm
was
sorry, go
gonna say-
ahead, please, Robert.
You say, Jason, I think you really hit on it there because
Mhm.
with a cleaner information stores, then people are able to more quickly and accurately find what they need to do their job, and
Absolutely.
therefore are able to make better decisions. They're not making a decision based on maybe slightly outdated data. They can drill down and find exactly what they need to do their job. It provides a more professional work environment for knowledge workers.
It
Well,
does.
and
And-
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, here's an analogy for you, Jason. So everybody has a junk drawer at home, right? And you put all your miscellaneous things in there. And when you open it, you're looking for your ruler or a rubber band, and it takes you 5 minutes to find it because all the other stuff that you've accumulated that offers no value at all sitting in there that you have to sort through every time you're looking for something.
That's
So
right.
it's the same thing with e-discovery, trying to find the pertinent and responsive data when you're doing a search.
Right. And I think some of the other costs and risks are out there around the fines and sanctions that are out there as we're getting more privacy rules like GDPR and some of those other ones.
Right.
You know, you work in the record space on with Gimmal. I do a lot of work on FOIA and DSTAR workflows.
Mhm.
You know, those are only going to get exponentially larger and larger, and being able to and the cost to actually respond to those without a good workflow and good, you know, if you have too much rot, it becomes super complicated.
Right. Yeah. And GDPR, especially, right, Jason? I mean, if anybody's ever done any Googling and seen some of the GDPR fines, they are not rounding errors. And so they are substantial. I mean, right now there's 5 states here that have privacy laws, and there's 7 more that they're inside of the legislation ready to be voted on. So
Okay.
it's coming.
And talking about lawsuits as well there's really two sides to that particular coin,
Mhm.
right? Not only do you have the risk of, you know, finding information and the cost of that, but it's also the risk of not finding the stuff that you actually really need. Think about an
Exactly.
intellectual property case, right?
Right.
Or a thought, you know, or some kind of, you know, or internal investigation. If you can't find the information that you really need to exonerate or really defend your organization, there's a lot of cost to that as well.
Absolutely.
So we have a question out there. Is there any existing analytics that correlates a small data lake with employee efficiency? Is there any existing analytics that correlates a small data lake with employee efficiency? So I have worked with a few organizations that have contemplated pulling together both primarily on the structured data side around pulling that from a data lake perspective to develop efficiency. I've not seen a lot of that on the unstructured data side because things are fairly siloed in the file server and email space where they're not aggregating them.
Right.
We have seen some folks look at building a metadata lake within an organization that ties some of those things together, but there's a significant amount of privacy concerns around what information gets put out there. So that's still, it's a great thought and very innovative, but I think at this time it's pretty challenging to actually implement that outside of theory.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you've seen that too, Robert. I mean, you've probably seen some of that in your work too, right?
Sure. Well, let's get a little more into the nuts and bolts of this and talk about some use cases and case studies, because you guys have been doing this in real life in the trenches.
Yep. So Jason, question for you. So what do you recommend methodology-wise to people when they're trying to analyze ROT to get an understanding of how do I determine the fork in the road of a record from a non-record or a ROT item?
Right. So the first place I always start is in a conversation. So you've got to talk to the people, you got to talk to the business, the people actually using, leveraging, and creating the data. You need to talk to the legal department and find out what are the risk and policies and things that they have to do. You have to talk to compliance. You have to talk to the finance people. And I think the first thing you do is just really get an understanding on both what is risk and what is also valuable to those type of things.
Sure.
And I usually work with people because the redundant piece is probably the easiest piece to deal with first and foremost.
Agreed.
Because you can find duplicative documents. You may have to decide where you want to store it or where the single source of truth is. Or you can address, how near do you want to be in terms of some of this data. Those are things those are nice little gauges you can do on the dashboard as you're making these decisions. But I think the first step is building that committee or that working group is going to help determine organization by organization what is going to be what and what isn't.
So do the clients typically know what data they want to tackle first, what they think is the most vulnerable, if you will?
Again, it's going to depend on the organization. My typical approach is you go to the heart of what an organization is required to do immediately and as part of the regulatory. For example, I like to start with finance because finance has very clear rules about what they could support, what they need to maintain, the length of what they need to do, and the types of documents or the type of records that they need to be able to manage. That is a really good place to start, right? And then for me, then I like to then go to business units because I need to start building traction within an organization.
Sure.
So I'll go to a couple of the kind of working groups, whether it's a project management organization or whether it's based on product or a division or something where we know that they're sharing and using knowledge within an organization, and then trying to identify what that is. And a lot of times what happens is that helps us start building a set of rules through, as we see here, what content is available, where are they storing the information, what are the types of documents, who are the owners of the properties. And that helps me start building a taxonomy, whether it's an organic taxonomy or a formal taxonomy. Those things are really, really critical to an organization.
So it's truly false that IT should be the one that is managing all this, because that's just not possible in the real world, is it?
Well, let's maybe phrase that statement just a little bit. So IT can manage it. Doesn't mean that they're responsible for the holistic, process of dealing with fraud.
Yeah.
IT, and actually we did a webinar a few months ago with Dean Meisenheimer with Gimmal. We talked about the role of the IT roles within a migration. It's a very similar thing, right? You need to have an information governance person who's going to spearhead the initiative, pull the people together, the diplomat, the politician, the person, the subject matter expert, who's going to be able to have conversations with people. In many cases, that's someone like myself in a fractional situation, or in other situations, it's going to be someone internal with a lot of organizations that have. But then you also need to have IT at the seat at the table, because at the end of the day, they're the one who's going to be implementing how the technology is going to be enabled. In many cases, they're going to be the people that are purchasing and managing the technology, managing the quality control of it. But it's not just an IT thing. You just can't say, IT, go fix my rot.
Exactly.
That's definitely not the right way of doing something.
And it's going to be an iterative process. So going through and thinking that the first time you make up everything is going to be foolproof, that's a little idealistic, quite honestly. So it's going to take some adjustments to that. So it's a measure 20 times, cut once mentality on all this, because you don't want to apply anything till, like you said, all the departments are buying off on it, which is a challenge, but it can be done. And then making sure that before you pull the trigger and start truly remediating data, that everybody is on board and that you do have backups in case you do need to revert back to where you were, just in case.
That's exactly right. And I find the process just absolutely fascinating, right? Because I've never had the same situation twice with the same organization, different categories. I mean, I've worked with educational groups, I've worked with, quasi-federal, quasi-governmental groups, I've worked with regulated industries, and each one of those is a very unique story. And the big challenge is making sure that you're asking either the internal people or leveraging resources like InfoGov World resources or people with IDP or CIGO, like that can help ask and facilitate those types of questions.
Yeah, and it's so important to have everybody involved that needs to be involved in this. You don't want to go all the way down the road and all of a sudden find out that one group who you didn't think needed to be involved in this process suddenly pops their head up and going, I disagree. I don't like any of this.
That does happen, but then you have to go, well, you weren't part of that process. Well, you know, that's where the diplomat and politician needs to come in, because everyone.
Yes, it is very political, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think this goes back into the labeling. And we'll talk a little bit about more of that practically, how that goes with the Gimmal technology, but labeling is the application of taxonomy and the knowledge of the information. And I define knowledge in the practical way of it's actionable information, right? So you can have something that's stored, put, tagged, whatever, but until it's actually used, it's still not knowledge.
Right.
That's kind of my approach around it. Cool. So one of the other things we've talked about, and let's kind of get a little deeper into this, is one of the things that help you in the qualifications for determining rot. And this goes back to, let's go to the O of rot, which is around the, what is obsolete?
Obsolete, yep.
So
except for me, I say outdated. I'm one of those guys, you know, that this is in the IG world, in the very esoteric small IG world, there's redundant, outdated, and trivial, or redundant, obsolete, and trivial. My opinion is it's outdated before it's obsolete, you know, and if it's outdated,
Sure.
That's met its life cycle requirements, and it needs to be deleted to make room for fresh information that has new business value. But that's just my soapbox.
No, I agree with that. That's a good statement.
But I've had arguments with CEOs, like in a live seminar, in person, he wanted to have this discussion, but neither here nor there. Either way, obsolete or outdated.
So I'll be my politician self and say, you're right and they're right, because it's. But talking about that, I was having a conversation with one of our workflow engineers, and you know he brought up the thing of, you know, date maybe not the right way of approaching what is outdated or obsolete. If you think about it, and you use this experience, you know, use this example with me, is the theory of relativity may be old, but it's not outdated, and it's definitely not obsolete.
Right.
Right. And so maybe date is not the right criteria. Now, that could be a place to start, but that needs to be tested. And if you're just kind of using a machete to say, okay, everything pre-2022 is going to be cut, that's a pretty sizable stuff. And you may be taking a lot of good knowledge and information away from your users.
Absolutely.
Sometimes a better measure is the date of last access and how frequently it might have been accessed. So if something hasn't been accessed for 5 years and it's not a historical record, you probably don't need it, you know? So you can prioritize it. You can structure those files in a way that you can say date last accessed, and then you can see, well, these aren't really important because nobody has touched these for 5 or 6 years. So that's another one of those things you can go look at when you're looking at rot.
Absolutely, because if you have a 3-year policy, for instance, you're going to draw that dark line of a 3-year policy, and the modification date of one file was only 2 years ago, and another one was 5 years ago, but the 5 years ago was accessed yesterday, and the modified one was a year ago. Which one's more important at this point? Which one's more recent or less outdated, if you will?
Right.
So it's a challenge. Like Jason said, I love the black and white world, but there's a lot of gray in this.
But that's okay, because life is gray. and that's really one of the cool things about what we do here, is because it's a wonderful, beautiful puzzle that we get to kind of unravel. That's why we came up with the title of Unravel.
Right.
And so, and these are some of the other tools. And then as soon as we get into this, Jeff, I'm going to pass it back to you to kind of show us some of the ways that Gimmal and Discover handle some of these things. But I mean, these are some of the tools and that we kind of leverage overall. You know, maybe age, could be last modified date, last access date. Finding the delta between those two becomes an interesting analysis piece.
Right.
What is the content, both in terms of, you know, the types of data that may be out there, what metadata is out there, who the data owner is. I mean, if it comes from the CEO, it probably needs to be retained potentially. You know, that could be rules. File type for the, you know, as well as location and some of the size. Do you really need, 14 terabytes of video data? Well, if you're YouTube, yeah, you do. I mean, if you're, if you're a school, you probably don't, because that may be someone hiding their video sharing program. So
Exactly.
those are things to be able to look at.
Yep, agreed.
So
So yeah, here's
Jeff,
some of the
let's
report
talk about reports.
permutations. Yeah. So this is to keep in mind, this is going for the metadata around file shares. I'm focusing a little bit on file shares on this. So obviously the data source is going to be dependent upon what metadata you have available. Email is going to have much more metadata than you're going to find in a file share. Probably a file share has the least amount, which makes it a little bit more of a challenge. But any permutation that you can think of, any order of these different metadata values, you can use in helping you to analyze, not to be the final decision, but to get some ideas around it, to know that, okay, maybe these are the ways I want to do this, and get some reports out of it. And once again, maybe you'll say, okay, I got the report and it's not what I was intending. I'm going to try something different. Don't be afraid to do that. You're going to be wrong sometimes in some of this analysis. Be prepared to adjust a rudder quickly and easily at the beginning, because it's going to get harder as you go, but to be able to actually find that methodology that works best for you.
Okay.
So yeah, go ahead, Jason.
So I just wanted to, again, we're talking about real life example here. So
Yep.
this is we're not going to get into the tool or technology, but I wanted to give everyone a little bit of a taste of some of the complexity and workflow of making decisions around looking for that particular data. This is a workflow of data analytics that we worked on with Jeff to implement the workflow for identifying credit card data, right? So this is a tool that's built in the Gimmal technology that really has pretty complex ways of identifying information and making decisions around it. There are thousands and thousands of use cases that we can basically build rules around, and it can be automated. And this is one of the, I really think, the cool things around the technology. But again, this is to kind of get a taste in terms of, this isn't a go find credit card information. There's a lot of thought that goes into those tools. There's logic that's required around them.
Yeah, so with this one, like you said, Jason, it's just going around and looking, in this case, for PCI, it's a personal credit information. Obviously, this could be PII as well, anything that personally identifies you. And that's interesting because people wonder, it's like, is PII just a social security number? It is not. Think of all the ways that you can identify a single person. In your zip code, if you're here in the States, then you're coming down to the household, your license plate, your VIN number on your car, all those things are ways of personally identifying you. And if somebody gets a hold of that information, I'm sure they'll find a way to try to do some identity theft. So being able to find this data sitting out there and to make sure that it's properly protected within your environment. We're actually offering a thing called the sensitive data assessment, looking for credit cards and socials and keywords, just to give you each client an idea of their exposure and possible risks they might have based upon a subset of data they have on their file shares. So it's just a way of getting you an idea of, should I be concerned?
Well, and one of the ways from a real life practical perspective that we've been dealing with this is related to FOIA responses for one of our governmental organizations, because you can't deliver that stuff because it's public record. You have to be able to find this in particular information. And as some of these FOIA or these open records requests become more and more complex, the risk to an organization is so high in terms of what information you can share out there. So being able to run this type of technology, run Discover on this data source before it gets produced, so important.
Yeah, so Jason, with that said, so FOIA, I'm guessing, has a maximum number of days to be able to comply, correct?
That's correct.
So once again, if you can reduce that rot and have it be a smaller set of data to search, you can reply to those requests sooner and most likely more accurately.
Right. So tell us a little bit about how Gimmal Discover really kind of kicks in and does some of this analysis.
Yeah, so this is what I was just talking about, the sensitive data assessment. So what this is going to do is we would go out and we would have a client nominate a subset of data on a file share. And we're going to go through and look for three things. We're looking for credit cards specifically, also social security numbers, and then any keywords or search expression, phrases, even using regular expressions. Those of you who have never heard of regular expressions, also known as regex, it helps find patterns. So that's what helps find the credit cards and the socials. but being able to go through, and then what we would produce as an artifact back to the client is saying, here is a sample of what we found. So in this case, around 13.5% or so of their data was sensitive, which is an aggregate of these 3 other pie charts. And then on the left-hand side, just giving them an overall view of the amount of data that we searched and some numbers regarding that, just to basically make you aware that look what I have, and maybe I should be concerned about what was found.
So Jeff, this reminds me a lot, going back to my computer forensics days, like a few years ago. I mean, it sounds like, and if I remember correctly, you know, the root and the heart of where Discover comes from really comes from that forensic side, right?
Right. Absolutely. And what we're doing on this, just to let you know, so anybody who's interested in this, is we are not collecting any PII. We do not want that information. All we're doing is we're going through the file, and we have 3 binary decisions. Does it contain a credit card, matching your keywords, or have a social? And it's basically a yes or no question. And then we just produce these statistics. So what you're looking at is a report out of Power BI. And what you can do is out of the report that Discover produces, you can create a CSV file, which can then be ingested into Power BI to be able to produce the proper charts that you want. And for those of you who ever use Power BI, it has a tremendous amount of reporting capabilities. I chose pie charts, but they could be bar charts or whatever else kind of charts you want to show.
Yeah, when Copilot comes out and finally to everybody, you're just going to be able to ask the question. You'll automatically be able to actually integrate it all. But
Right.
Little cool stuff on the horizon. So
Very much so.
So tell me about some of the data sources that you were able to pull this information from, Jeff.
Good question. So we're going to do all the 365 ones, and that is going to be OneDrive, SharePoint, Exchange, as well as Teams. And we also do on-prem Exchange for those people who still have on-prem Exchange, and they do exist out there.
Absolutely.
That are a little cloud adverse. We also do PSD files if anybody's still allowing those. We have quite a few clients that want to find the PSD files because they don't want that distributed data sitting out there on the share, or even worse, on the laptop. A lot of times they'll include EMLs and MSGs as that, because those are single messages also stored as a file. We also do, outside of Microsoft, we do Box, Gmail, both from Google Workspace, both Gmail and Google Drive, and Dropbox is coming soon. And endpoints. We do both Windows endpoints, and we also do Mac endpoints. So it's our first foray into the Apple world of being able to go out and do that. So if you're interested in the endpoint, the way it works, it's a silent deployment to the laptops and desktops. So the users would have no idea that it's sitting out there, and it's going to run as a service. And then it'll communicate back up to the database in the cloud to be able to push its data that we found back up to the database. So
if we're thinking about this, you know, so this goes back into some of the work that we've been doing on the migration side, right, to help discern what this rot could be. So, you know, so let's assume that our mutual client has worked with us, we've helped them build the policies, we're helping them try to figure out what the rot is. This is where now we come together with the Gimmal technology and say, okay, working with the IT people,
right,
we're going to help figure out how to deploy that. So what are the type of people that you're typically working with at our organization to help get this going at the technology level?
It's pretty much the same ones that you've talked about earlier. I mean, it's getting all teams. IT is typically the one I'm working with directly, because they have the ability to deploy the necessary components to the on-premises locations that actually do the work. But as you said, Jason, risk is going to be involved. Legal might well be involved, security as well. I mean, HR, who knows if they might be there. Pick a department. The business units, a lot of times in this case.
How about records management?
Well, definitely records management. That's for sure. Because, you know, this is where, Robert, we're trying to figure out what's a record and what isn't, right? So with this sensitive data, then is that something we want to keep? And if so, let's get it more secured. If it's not something we want to keep, we need to get rid of it. So those making those decisions, records definitely need to be involved.
Yeah, you don't want to be deleting records. You need to have them involved. So you know what is the official record, and what are working copies that may be able to you can get rid of.
Absolutely, and like Jason said earlier, you got the rules and regulations of the vertical markets that are also going to be making sure that they're being followed properly as well. So, you know, pharmaceutical, anything that has to keep their data longer, then we need to make sure for that rot processing that they're applying those regulations to that data.
Well, and Jeff, you bring up a really good point. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Brian.
I was gonna say, and probably gonna need general counsel or legal involved before you blow something away. And so an in-between step might be to put it, kind of quarantine it in the cloud and say, hey, but we're getting approval for this. We might, in 30 days or 90 days, if you don't need it, if you can't give us a good business case for it, then it's gonna go. And that would probably satisfy your general counsel in terms of, not deleting something that the business units really need.
Agreed.
Well, Jeff came up with a really good idea. Him and I were chatting over the last week or so, and he gets like, well, we could just basically turn off the file and make them request it. And if they don't request it, they probably don't need it, right?
Exactly.
So, and these are some of the cool things of even you could do that now as you're moving things into Microsoft. You can set those in 365. You can set those rules in place to really find out what you really need to keep. And again, some of the cool technologies that are out.
Yeah, because what's funny, Jason, is if you ask me, hey, do you need that? My knee-jerk reaction is going to be, absolutely, I need that data. But am I ever accessing it? Probably not. So the analogy I told Jason about when we were discussing this was I had a friend that bought a new house, and they emptied out their utility drawer in the kitchen that has the spatulas and the spoons, whatever. What they did was they put all those in a box. As they used them in the new house, they put them in the drawer. Anything still in the box after a year, they threw away. So use that same kind of methodology here, is take a file and either lock it down, don't let the user access it and see if they complain, or move it somewhere else and see if they miss it. I mean, it's funny human nature that we'll say, yes, we need it. Most of the times we really don't.
Right. So Robert, I know we have some homeowner reports, but it looks like we have another question or comment that came through. You want to kind of walk to that, Robert? You're on mute, Robert.
Yeah, I was holding that for later, but
Okay.
it was something that was discussed earlier. So let's do it at the end.
All right, sounds good. Sounds good. So let's talk about some of the other reports that we can pull out of this and walk us through these tools.
Yeah, so what I did was in this, the report that came out of Discover that fed into this, once again, all we have is some metadata, the creation date, the modified date, the extension of the file, last access date, whether or not it was a credit card or any sensitive data, and also the size of each file. And what we produced out of this was showing, in this case, there's 3 different age range reports we have here. The first one is the creation date. So do you use the creation date as part of your criteria? Honestly, I would say creation date would be the one I would use last. As my criteria, I would think modification or last access would be more important. But just to show a breakdown, and then you'll see the bar chart at the top and at the bottom, it's just showing you the various types of data within those age ranges. And those age ranges can be anything you want, obviously. We're not locking you into the ones I did. I just picked 10 different ones. And 20 years plus, you might think we don't have any data that old. I think you might be surprised that you really do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do, but it's all very valuable. I've already sorted and organized it using my own information governance principles.
Good for you, Jason.
Here's
Then
another
the next one is
modified.
the modified date. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing going through. You'll notice that the older age ranges have more documents on this one than it did on the creation, because things get modified after they've been created. But it still seems to, as you get more recent, than the larger number of data sitting out there. But imagine, if you will, if you said, okay, we're going to try to get rid of everything over 5 years old. Obviously, not everything's going to go, but it's going to get a lot of space back. And once again, save you from having to search all this to back it up, all the things that are attributed with having that high volume of data.
Hey, I'm going to jump in with this comment that was made because it's relevant to this here. Anna says last access date could be an issue. We were talking earlier about last access date could indicate it's more important than we think. Last access date could be an issue if we have have records or email or files that have long-term retention and they are just waiting for the retention to expire.
Okay.
During this time, there may not be much access to those files, but they still need to be kept. And I would just say agreed,
I would say that too. And that's where you probably get into, and Jason, tell me what you think about this. You'd get into the content of the file, or if you have any kind of metadata that leads you to believe what it is, like a structured naming standard on your file shares, then that would help a lot. But otherwise, I think you're getting into the content. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. And the content is important. So it's really good to use the metadata layer or the metadata or, just to kind of get an understanding of what kind of, it's the first point of triage, if you would. But
Exactly.
then you've got to start getting into the content and the data and whether it's really truly valid. And there is
Yep.
some really cool technology out there. We like Discover, and I like using Discover because it really has some cool, capabilities in terms of searching, because it does come from the forensic background. What I think is really cool is like the OCR capability. It's not really OCR. I mean, it takes non-indexable documents, picture files, PDF files that aren't indexable, and it basically scrapes those so I can actually look at the document without having to convert it to a PDF file.
Correct.
Amazing.
Yeah, so when people hear OCR, they're thinking, well, you're converting the file. We are not. What we're doing is what Jason said. We're scraping the text out of it to be able to search for your keywords, expressions, what have you. But that file's in the exact same format it was before we looked at it. And the last access date is also the same when we looked at it. So we're not going through that process and affecting any of that because we just want to be able to see inside of that, typically like a TIFF file or a non-image or an image-based PDF, to be able to look for that kind of data.
We have kind of a follow-up comment or question here, which says, unfortunately, many users are not great at completing metadata. Well, that's why we want to automate that as much as possible. We want to, auto-classify, auto-populate, more and more AI so that we can get that done and take it out of the user's hands. Because, users, they want to retrieve it fast, but they don't feel like it's their job to index and type in or entry.
That's the old thing of, hey, I need to enter it fast because I don't care what it takes later. Right. I mean, you're going to use it more often than you create it. So by all means, take that time to get the proper metadata on it. So in the future, somebody besides you actually has a clue to what it is. But that's an easier thing to say than practice, I realize.
Yeah, but with M365, this is becoming less and less of an issue, I think, because it's more and more automated and auto classification is becoming less expensive and more reality. She goes on to ask, should we be looking at content for most of the files or messages? So
I would.
Yeah.
I would. I mean, I try to figure out what is your criteria, what makes something a responsive document or privileged or proprietary or formula or whatever it might be. Find that data first. One of the things that Gimmal Discover can then do is to apply a label to that data. So we can say this is PII or this is a contract or this is an invoice, whatever labels you want to assign to that data. And then we can use that intelligence now that we have and know what the content is. We never have to look at the content again. Now we can use that label, which will help expedite the search process because you could then say, I only want to search contracts. We know where the contracts are. Instead of looking at the entire set of data, which could be petabytes, instead we have a focused data set that's much smaller to be able to review.
So Jeff, you bring up a really good point.
We have a bit of a follow-up comment. And this just depends, I think, on the software you're using, but it says you also need to be mindful that when data is moved to new storage equipment, the data may get a modified date of the day and time that it was moved. Correct. That really depends on the software functionality. And if you know that's the case, you want to flip that, toggle that, off or on to make sure that doesn't happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've heard of SharePoint migrations from file shares that the metadata didn't come over. What you just basically did is got rid of all that history and that audit trail is gone. And now you're starting as though you started SharePoint with a petabyte of data and you have no idea what's old and what isn't. So that metadata is so important to maintain.
Yeah, I've heard of that issue with SharePoint. They moved it over and they lost the old dates,
Yeah.
It's automatically updated it,
You bring up a couple points, right? So again, it's that migration process and the tools and the switches used to move it properly. Now, there are ways of doing, getting beyond that, but you're now adding cost and complexity because the actual creation date and the metadata of that particular record or file, especially documents, like Word documents, Excel files, is maintained in the internal metadata of a document. It's there, you can find it, but now we've got to do a much more deep crawling of the content, which takes longer, costs more money, and it can be more complex. But if I may ask permission, I'd like to jump on my Microsoft 365 soapbox for just a second, because one of the things that I am passionate about these days is enabling the technology that Microsoft is bringing to the plate for organizations and enterprises around knowledge management. And our vision is to take the rot that is in an organization, being able to start creating policies, applications, tagging, and labeling it as part of the movement process, and getting it into the Microsoft suite as best as possible with as much reasonable information that's available, without having to have someone look at it document by document by document and actually create that metadata. The powerful tools that Microsoft is coming out with Microsoft Purview, which is their compliance technology that allows for auto classification, taxonomy management, and then also Microsoft Viva, which is their knowledge management platform, which also can do very personalized knowledge creation based on the right data for the right person at the right time, based on Active Directory, as well as the policies and labeling and tagging within the Microsoft suite, is extremely powerful. So this isn't a one and done. This is a step of moving to the future for an organization. And I can't just say, well, boy, I just want to get rid of my data and do a lift and shift, or maybe I can do some filtering. That's just the beginning of the journey, folks. What Microsoft is going to be giving us for the next 10 to 15 years as part of the M365 solution will save people time, increase productivity, and I mean, the opportunity is huge for people right now. And so that's why I get super excited about this, and why I'm excited about ROT again, because now we can start doing stuff with the data. All right, that's my soapbox. I'm done.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about a few more of these files. What are the other things that we can look at?
Yeah. The next one is access. How about going to the next slide, Jason? That's a little bit different for us. And that's going to be by the extensions. So, pardon me. So what we're doing here is we're going out and just collecting the extensions of the files and get an idea, because that's a very interesting information to have when you're starting your ROT analysis, to get an idea. I actually did this for a company, and believe it or not, they had over 5,000 extensions. I didn't realize that many existed. I think a lot of those were maybe softwares creating other files, but it's good to know what your breakdown is and what you have out there. I mean, maybe you consider MP3s, MP4s to be trivial. Pardon me. Maybe not, but it gives you that information to be able to start making some informed decisions. Pardon me while I take a drink.
No worries. So, and I think that's super important. Like we were working with one client that they, as I mentioned before, they discovered probably 2 terabytes of video files. But what happened is that it was for an academic institution. It was basically one of the students were using the quote unquote free soft storage that they had to basically manage their file sharing business, right? And once they were able to identify that, they're able to again reduce the risk and control their costs. So.
Jeff, real quick, Jeff, we have a question here. Do you recommend managing files by extension?
Do I recommend it as the only means? No, but I think it can provide nice insight for you. I don't think there's any one metadata. Like, I wouldn't just use the modification date. I wouldn't just use the file name. I wouldn't just use the extension. I think it's the mixture, and then you have to get into the content again to really have an understanding, which actually is part of this triage slide that we're seeing here.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, and it really is a triage process. I'm never going to go to someone and say, okay, here's your IG policy. This is a long-term iterative. Let's build the playbook. Let's build the rules. Let's continue to test. This is this is not a 3-year project. It's not a 5-year project. This is a lifetime organizational lifetime initiative that you can do by creating sort of project. But it's all about just triaging information, right? Get rid of our, find and deal with our redundant files. Let's figure out what the subset of information is. What can we label? And how do we then label that? And then figure out what can't be labeled, unindexed files or things like that, because that's a separate process. I love buckets. I'm all about putting things in the bucket, right? Yep. And the more buckets you can identify, the makes it easier to identify further buckets. And that's what the policies and the labels all are about.
Absolutely. Yeah, those labels are so important, Jason, because here we are with these labels right here. So basically what you're doing is you're going through your historical or legacy data and saying, what do I have out there? So the beauty of the labels, it's a proactive step. meaning that we can go through, for instance, pick on file shares again. Let's go through all your file shares. We could start with all files last accessed 20 years ago and then 15 years ago. So you could bite this off in small bits. And then once this data is all done, we never have to label it again. Unless you have additional labels and change your criteria, we never have to look at it again. And now we can flip the script and say, I'm only going to look at the deltas, anything that's been added or modified. And once a week, I'm going to review those and I'm going to apply the label. So now that process is such a small set of data that we're actually managing, but we have all this historical information with these labels that we can leverage at any time. If we want to do governance or rediscovery on a particular label or labels, it runs exponentially faster than trying to process that entire set of data.
So Jeff, let me ask a point of clarification. So
Yep.
when you're talking about labeling, let's talk about where practically does that label go? Does that stay in the Gimmal system? Does it get put in the, the system where the data is being stored? Where does that label go?
Great question. So what the label does, the way Discover does it, there's a thing called the alternate data stream for data. So it's basically a field, if you will, on the, or metadata on the file or the email that is for programmatic use. So we actually set that value. So if a user went into File Explorer, they would not see the label applied. If the user went into Outlook, they're not going to see the label that's applied. It's a programmatic labeling and accessing of it. So the good news is it's actually on the file and email. So if the file gets copied somewhere, that label persists. If the email gets copied somewhere, that label persists. So we're not keeping it inside of Discover. We're keeping it on the file or email itself. So at any time we can review it and use that for analysis.
Right. Yeah, I've always learned that the less decisions a user has to make around managing the backend taxonomy and labeling, the better off you're going to be.
Oh, absolutely. And no offense to the users, but you don't want them doing this either. Now,
Exactly.
if they're the final reviewer, like, if you're going to go out and delegate the responsibility, like if you have a user's drive on a file share, they're going to know best of anybody of what can be kept and what can't. But to them to have the final and the ultimate decisions on everything, probably not a great idea.
That's right.
Hey guys,
So-
we're close to top of the hour here, but we do have a question. We have another question. For organizations that have email deletion policies of say 90 days or so, what should be what are the best repositories to use to house actual business records after rot is identified and removed, for instance, in SharePoint and so forth?
Yeah, I would not put them on the file share because, SharePoint is obviously a much more modern version of storage. Same with OneDrive. Now, OneDrive is supposed to be personal, but I would think SharePoint would be where you would want your data to go that you want to protect and secure.
Well, more file shares, right? We're not, again, let's differentiate between emails and file shares.
Yeah, really, depending, you may have a content management system as well, or content services that you could move it to, and Gimmal is one of those. So that's a managed environment, and you always want to, the goal is to really to get rid of the shared drives and as much as you can, and ultimately get rid of them and move that into a managed environment.
Sure.
So to address email specifically, there's if you're in a regulated space, you're typically going to work with tools that have what they call compliance archives that are specifically designed to manage email in regulated and industries.
Yeah.
Outside of regulated industries, and even within those, again, Microsoft M365 and their Exchange their Exchange in the cloud tool does have capabilities of building and managing those particular policies. It really comes down to what's going to work best with your organization and what the right rules are
Right.
for that particular organization.
Agreed.
Working with big financial services clients, they're typically still using the big email compliance technologies because of the way that they have to store data and manage that. But smaller organizations, private equity firms, or even small pharma companies, a lot of times they're doing that now and managing that within the Microsoft suite. But when it comes to the records, I think Gimmal Records is a really strong technology in terms of managing both paper and electronic records that are
Correct.
quote unquote canon, if you would.
Yep.
And within that, you have the stuff that you're not really sure about, that you're not sure if it's a quote unquote record or canon. Then SharePoint and policies within that can be managed that way as well.
What's really interesting, Jason, is I probably have helped people with hundreds of email retention policies, helping them configure them over the years. And I don't think there's any two the same. I mean, that's the beauty of that. With all the metadata and all the things that you can use in different permutations of that, nobody's doing the same thing, and that's fine. So whatever's best for you, there's no right or wrong with that.
Right. Cool. Any other questions, Robert?
No other questions, and I've just put in the chat the discount code for our attendees here that stayed with us till the end. GML 25. If you go to the InfoGovWorldExpo.com or InfoGovWorldConference.com website, when you check out, you can get 25% off of a full conference pass or a one-day pass. So GML 25 at checkout, just it says apply your code, put in your code, and you get 25% off. So we encourage you to come out to San Diego and come for the content and stay for the great Southern California vibe. And going to be a lot of really top professionals in information governance out here. So I encourage everyone to come out and get from the horse's mouth, the experts that really are in the industry. And we appreciate you guys today. Thanks very much, Jeff and Jason. And
Thank you.
We'll
Thank
see
you,
you
Robert.
all out there, and hopefully see you in San Diego.
All
In
right.
San Diego.
Okay, very
Thanks,
good.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.